storytelling plays an even more important role than I think it does in just the standard startup world. We're faced with this very, very difficult to wrap our head around issue called climate change. So how do you tell a story to investors that let them both understand the gravity of the challenge that you're taking on, but at the same time be able to show them that there's a very market-driven, profitable solution?
Hello and welcome to the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast, where we interview business leaders and emerging market experts on business innovations, market opportunities, and macro-level trends in emerging and frontier market countries. Join us for the next hour to dive deep into the world of emerging markets as we speak with top performers who are successfully investing, working, and living in these markets themselves. Welcome to the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. I'm here with Jamil Wyne. He's an INSEAD 18J, and he's an investor, advisor, and professor focused on emerging market development and climate technology. From 2015 to 2022, he spent 7 years at the World Bank advising on entrepreneurship and innovation. Prior to that, he was in the Middle East and North Africa for 7 years, doing everything from being a Fulbright Fellow to founding the Wamda Research Lab, a lab in Jordan that focuses on entrepreneurial development across the Middle East, North Africa region. He's currently an angel investor and advisor at UNICEF's Climate and Innovation Fund, Antler, Clean Energy Venture Group, and Catalyst Investment Management. He's an adjunct professor at George Washington University and the co-lead of Oxford's Climate Tech Initiative. As creator-in-residence, he runs Climate Tech Bootcamp, which is being incubated right now at CoLeap in London. And he's helped to build funds and technology systems in a range of countries, including Jordan, Greece, Serbia, Singapore, Oman, Ukraine, Egypt, Japan, Kuwait, Iraq, and Bangladesh. His work has been featured or cited in the World Economic Forum, McKinsey, TechCrunch, the Wall Street Journal, MIT's Innovations Magazine, Al Jazeera, the World Bank, United Nations, Brookings, and Wharton publications, as well as various university curriculum books. So quite an impressive intro, to say the least, and sounds like you're up to so many different interesting things, so there's a lot of ways that we could go with this, but I think maybe a good place to start would be just for you to tell me what made you originally decide to leave the U.S. You graduated from college back in 2008 when you were in D.C., and then you went to Egypt and didn't come back for 8 years, so kind of curious how that journey began and what made you go out there, stay out there, and remain there for the lengthy time that you did before eventually returning to the U.S.
Yeah, of course, and Nick, thanks so much for having me on. Really glad that Emily Abrams connected us, so I'll have to thank her as well. And also just really, really glad that you're doing this. I think it's important both to think about INSEAD's role in emerging markets, as well as give a platform for the alumni themselves that are working on these issues. So appreciate this larger opportunity that you give INSEAD. So regarding your question of why I went abroad, I think part of that was just baked into the way that I was raised. My dad is from Pakistan originally. My mom is from the U.S., so from day one, I was encouraged to think from a somewhat global angle. So a lot of emphasis on international relations, international affairs, but also culture, religions, et cetera, of the world. So that was something that was often discussed and dinner tables, et cetera, and throughout my extended family. I think the reason why I settled on the Middle East was there's a few reasons. So on one hand, because my dad is from Pakistan, my family does have connections to the Islamic world, or like the larger Islamic world. And when we talk about the Islamic world, we often think about the Middle East, sometimes first and exclusively. And so I had been thinking about Middle East for quite a while. And it's also quite hard to study any type of Islamic or Muslim history and not go into a study of the Middle East in some shape or form, even if you're not even focusing on the region. It makes itself known. So that was one reason. The other was I was junior in high school when 9/11 happened, and just like anybody, you couldn't help but take notice, be very afraid, but also at the same time realize that there were, at a bare minimum, some very fundamental gaps in terms of how we understood and interacted with the Middle East, both as Americans, but as a global population. So I felt that it was in some ways a responsibility, but also an amazing opportunity to not just pay attention to other narratives in the region beyond one of conflict and uncertainty, which a lot of media would lead us to believe is the only way to view the region, but also is one that has to be studied by being on the ground. It's very difficult to appreciate the nuances of the region. It's also very easy to fall in the trap of thinking that the region is homogenous if you're not physically based there. And so I felt as if I wanted to be proficient in the general goings on of the region, but also wanted to start building a career for myself that focused on these big questions of economic development, intercultural interactions, et cetera, that I needed to be physically based there. And Egypt was a great starting point. It has a track record of bringing in really, really diverse expats and projects from all around the world. And it made a lot of sense to kick off my time in the region there.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. I think you definitely need to be physically based in a place to really understand it and affect the kind of change that you may want to. And it's also really interesting to hear your initial motivations. Looking at your resume, of course, it's extremely impressive, but you wouldn't know just looking at it that 9/11 happened and all the other backstory that led you to doing what you are. I guess I see that your first role out there in Egypt was with Ashoka Arab World, and I was wondering what the progression was from going out there for the reasons that you initially did to your eventual focus on climate and entrepreneurship.
Sure. So really good question. And I think sometimes I still have to figure out how the pieces fit together a little bit, even if it's in hindsight, it still doesn't always make total sense. But the way I think about it is that with Ashoka in particular, it's built to focus on social entrepreneurs. So you're working with early stage companies, both nonprofit and for-profit, that are run by individuals that are usually very, very ambitious and very impact driven, so that they are trying to use their organization to promote gender equality, energy access, poverty alleviation, youth empowerment, innovative solutions to healthcare. So you get exposed to a really wide range of just high impact solutions and efforts that go into building those solutions and scaling them. And so Ashoka, by definition, is introduced me to this larger world of supporting emerging market entrepreneurs. And I think one of the reasons that I really dug into it was, especially when you're working in lower income countries that sometimes we'd label as emerging markets or developing countries or frontier markets, you usually have some common traits or characteristics where there's large unemployment levels, a lack of access to resources. Even if people are enrolling in schools and universities, the job outcomes and quality of the education is sometimes, you could say, up for grabs a bit or uncertain. And in parallel, you often have governments that have minimal, if not non-existent capacity to take care of their populations. And so because of that, you inevitably look to the private sector and say, well, the jobs, the wealth creation, the new tech and innovation that will diffuse itself through society will probably come from private companies. But at the same time, then you realize that oftentimes private sector growth is constrained in these countries. So you're kind of left with just looking at, well, what is the entrepreneur up to? Right? You almost, it feels a little bit like a process of elimination game where eventually you end up with the entrepreneur. And I think that they take on a heightened importance when you're working in these types of markets where there is such a high demand for any type of economic activity, full stop. You know, they don't have the luxury of Silicon Valley. They don't even have the luxury of other metro areas that we have in the US that aren't necessarily known as hotbeds of innovation, but they are dynamic metro areas that are attracting people to come and live and go to work and raise their families, et cetera. So when you don't have that, I think there's even more of a burden, but also opportunity around entrepreneurs. And so that's what helped me double down on that, so to speak. Ashoka was certainly the launch pad. And I think I've stayed on that course from ever since. The reason why I've added climate into the work I do, it actually started when I was in the Middle East. I was working, this is when I was in Jordan, and this is when I was, become head of research at Wamda. And I had these very naive observations where the region is home to a critical mass of fossil fuels, is also home to a critical mass of sunshine, and it also has some of the most water scarce countries in the world. So the water scarcity plus the abundance of potential solar power, it also has a lot of desalination capacity. So I saw these different data points and, as I said, kind of naively said, well, why aren't we doing more on climate, right? We have clearly a lot of entrepreneurial talent and interest in supporting entrepreneurs. Why aren't we thinking about how to support early stage innovations around climate? Because those seem to be the needs that are most acute in the region, but also could have the most debilitating effect on the region if they go unchecked. If we run out of water and run out of food or face significant constraints to the supplies, I don't have to tell you why that's a problem. And so I felt like it was this massive yet very attractive question mark. And I have a friend and mentor. His name is Enes Ramawi, who actually runs Catalyst Private Equity, who has been at the forefront of thinking about these questions for quite a long time. And so I kind of latched onto him. And with Wamda in particular, actually, we ended up striking a partnership with General Electric. They also had a big interest in understanding what are the big trends surrounding what we called clean tech back then. And we did a study and mentorship project of clean tech entrepreneurs throughout the region. And so met probably every clean tech, or now what we would call climate tech innovator, every fund, every incubator. And there weren't that many. That's why we were, I think, able to meet all of them or get close to it. And like I said, a lot of this was born from my original set of interests in thinking, well, what is the role of an entrepreneur in general in fostering economic development? But when I started thinking more critically about the climate dimension, I said, well, pretty much apply the exact same question and kind of analytical lens to understanding what's the role of entrepreneurs in supporting climate-related outcomes in the region. And so it felt, and still does feel, like a very natural extension or next chapter in the work I do. I think my regret is that I didn't double down on it back then, and I waited 4 or 5 years later to revisit my work on that theme. And now, of course, focus on it nearly full time, but it took a little bit of a pause before I went back into it full steam ahead.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Renewables may not be the first thing that you think of when you think of the Middle East and energy, but if you think more about it, it makes a lot of sense. It's an area with a lot of sunshine, a lack of water, and other resources. So there are definitely the challenges and opportunities there that make it a place that could benefit from focusing on it. I want to get to why you started the Climate Tech Bootcamp, but before we go there, I was wondering if you have any stories of entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial ventures you worked with in your time out there that you found to be most impactful, or that showed you that entrepreneurship is a way that you can make the most impact in these more developing or emerging market countries.
Sure. So one of the blessings of being able to work with Wamda and be based in Jordan was that we got access to entrepreneurs and innovators throughout the region. And Jordan has both political and economic linkages with a lot of countries around the region. The entrepreneurs that are in the country often start in Jordan, but then scale their companies into neighboring countries. So we, just by virtue of being part of the company, were on a daily basis meeting new entrepreneurs. And it was just really amazing. And it was inspiring. At times, too, it was a little bit intimidating because you were meeting these people that were building things that were truly incredible when in terms of the size that they were able to grow their enterprises to, but also just the type of impact they were having. But so it was certainly one of the big perks of being part of that team. One company that has always stuck out to me as being a great example of very intentional impact that's born from there being just a ginormous gap in the market is a company called Altibi, which is, when it was created, it was effectively called or you could have called it the WebMD of the Middle East. And so if you think about it, we don't, in the US, it's very difficult for us or me to imagine a world without WebMD, right? It seems like something that's almost a public good at this standpoint. Like it's just something we expect to be there. You know, having that luxury of just looking up pretty much any ailment, condition, question you have around your personal health is just an amazing asset. And at one point that didn't exist, of course, and somebody had to build it. And so when it comes to thinking about how do you replicate that in a non-native English speaking country, you again have to build it. There's not a seamless translation button that you can hit necessarily. And not just in terms of translation, but how do you customize that knowledge, right? Because cultures perceive different questions and topics in healthcare differently. And so how do you ensure that it's localized and relevant? So Altibi was, I got to meet the founder essentially when he was in his first year of doing it. I mean, it was way back. His name is Jamil Wyne. He founded it with his father, actually. And I mean, they have consistently, I think, just blown me away in terms of the reach, the impact. And I think also there's a really good set of lessons that emerges from it around how you, as I said earlier, companies and entrepreneurs in these markets take on a multi-sided impact thesis. And so they're an endeavor entrepreneur. They've gotten a lot of major funds to invest in them. There was recently a Harvard Business School case that came out on them. So really remarkable. And that's just an example of one company. Another one that I'll give a quick plug to is my friend Zaid Fredek is the head of something called cited MENA, Semantic Information Technology MENA. serial entrepreneur. He started building the company he was in university. He is locally born and bred, a brilliant mind, very humble human being as well. But his ability to bring people together, see big opportunities to actually grow his company, but then leverage the lessons and obviously the wealth that was created through that company to launch a fund. So now off of the progress of that, they've launched a fund. Now they're launching a venture studio. So the fund is called Propeller. The studio is called Builder, which is run by another good friend of mine, Nafez Dekak. I thought that story was just really remarkable because it goes to show in a lot of ways the same story that we'd like to talk about in the US, where serial entrepreneur does very well and then they start building an ecosystem around them. I'd like to think that Zaid and his team have been able to do that. And it's a great example that I think others in the region can follow. And certainly they've been having a lot of impact along the way too.
Totally, yeah. A lot of times you just need one successful founder in a country or region to really set the place forward. There's the famous story of the Skype founder in Estonia and how it became a hub for entrepreneurship after his success. So the more people you can have like that in the world, the better.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think I'd like to move on to the Climate Tech Bootcamp, since it seems like that is your main focus right now, even though there's obviously so much that you're involved with. What made you decide to launch the bootcamp and what are you trying to accomplish with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it actually came a little bit randomly, and there's actually an INSEAD connection is there as well. So another INSEAD alum is a friend of mine, Ashoka, is an investor in a company called CoLeap, which is an ed tech platform in the UK that builds out learning communities around specific subject areas. So, learning community on fintech or team building or no code. And so he introduced me to the CEO, Pablo, who's a really great guy. And Pablo and I were talking about, well, does CoLeap have an interest in trying to build some type of course around climate and climate tech in particular? And we started talking last year about this. And at the time, I felt that, one, it was very interesting. So I wanted to do it. I enjoy the academic and teaching side of life. And it's something that I've tried to build out in my own career. And I also just felt that there was an opportunity, right? We're at that point, especially in the early days of really talking about climate tech seriously and across societies and economies. We're still, needing to figure out how do you find entrepreneurs, how do you support them and kind of expedite their process in the early days in particular. So I wanted to contribute to that process, but I didn't know really what model would make most sense for doing that. And of course, you can go the investor route. You can obviously found a company yourself. You can build an accelerator. You can build policy, et cetera. So there's plenty of ways to interact with and support entrepreneurs. And so this one in particular was a little bit of a question mark for me. Like, where could we take this? What really do entrepreneurs need right now? And the reason why we ended up doing it was, aside from the fact that I thought it was just an interesting opportunity, I think that there's this large need to start breaking down silos between different ecosystems around the world when it comes to supporting entrepreneurs that are focusing on climate. Right now, if you look at the climate tech hubs in the world, it's effectively the same types of hubs that you see in standard VC. So Silicon Valley and Boston, Tel Aviv and London and Singapore, et cetera. It's where a lot of the innovation around climate is happening. And that's also just in general where a lot of innovation full stop happens. And so as somebody that spent a lot of their time abroad in their career, I felt like if we keep going in this direction, we're going to miss out on a lot of really good opportunities, both to support entrepreneurs and more importantly for impact, especially in countries that don't have the luxury of saying we've got an MIT or a Stanford or University of Tel Aviv, et cetera, and therefore have a hub for supporting startups. So on one hand, I think we just got lucky. The timing was right. We found an interesting fit. And when we brought on the learners to actually kick off the boot camp, and as I saw applications coming through, I said, okay, there's actually demand for this. We had a person who used to be the head of Africa for Dahlberg. We had somebody who was a geochemistry PhD from Columbia who sold a company join us. We had somebody who was a Forbes 30 under 30 who used to work on the climate team at the White House, right? So we saw that there were people that wanted to build things in climate coming from different countries and at the same time with amazing credentials. And so it made a lot of sense for us to not just do the boot camp, but then think about, well, how do we take this to the next level? Something with more structure, with more of a strategy, which is frankly what we're still trying to figure out. I think it's going to be a process that evolves over time. But I think what we see it evolving into is a very important starting point. Any entrepreneur from around the world that's working on climate can leverage when he or she is just starting down this path. I think we probably will do our best work when we find people who are not brand new entrants into the labor market, but people that have built up an expertise, say for 5+ years in a certain area, and they're now thinking about how do I translate what I've done and learned into focusing on climate. And I think something that's also important to note is that our goal is to support entrepreneurs here, right? So we're building out a program that brings in, or we run a program rather, that brings in mentors and investors to help run expert-led sessions, current entrepreneurs in climate as well to help run sessions. So we want to bring in as many resources and obviously individuals that can provide tangible, practical guidance to entrepreneurs. But we're also seeing that it can be a launch pad for people that are just starting to kick off their climate careers, right? So we had one person who was very, very lucky to get him in our cohort as well. He used to be a VP of sales at LinkedIn, Slack, and Salesforce, all when they IPO'd. In his case, he wasn't looking to start a company, but this person would be an extremely valuable hire to anybody. So just being able to get to know him, understand ways we could support him. He's obviously a very, very talented individual. So I think he was already well on his way to doing something very interesting, and he landed a great job at a climate tech startup. But again, he's just another proof point, I think, that there's demand for this type of program, and we need to keep building it out and making sure that we're reaching as wide audience as possible, but even more important, as diverse an audience as possible. We had people from the US and UK and Germany, which are your usual suspects when you're talking about VCs and entrepreneurs in climate as well, but we also had people from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Senegal, somebody based in Japan. So it just showed us that there's a global climate game and population of innovators that we want to be working with.
That's awesome. Yeah, that sounds like it's got really high level people, and it definitely provides a lot of value. Could you talk a little bit more about what people who join the bootcamp could expect from it?
Absolutely. So, I mean, on short answer to that is it's always evolving. I think we're still trying to figure out what's the right ingredients and number of mentors and sessions and curriculum. That's a lot of that is work in progress. But if somebody were to enroll today, and our applications for the next cohort are going to go out in about 2 weeks, if somebody were to enroll in that cohort, what they would expect to find is 8 live sessions, each hour and a half long, over a 4-week period. In each one of those, it's led by myself and one of our expert instructors. So we have a mixture of climate investors and climate entrepreneurs that are working with me to deliver the course content. From a curriculum standpoint, you could expect to see everything from helping you walk through the process of researching business problems and opportunities in climate, to actually when you're sitting down one-on-one with an investor focusing on climate as well, how do you structure that conversation in such a way that you maximize the chances of something meaningful coming from it? Not necessarily an investment, but meaningful could be getting tangible advice that you can then implement, and you develop a strategic relationship that can pay off down the line with that investor. We're also going to be working on storytelling with climate in particular. When you're talking to investors as well as potential employees and partners, storytelling plays an even more important role than I think it does in just the standard startup world. We're faced with this very, very difficult to wrap our head around issue called climate change, that any of these companies is going to be cutting off a tiny piece of that larger problem and contributing a solution to it. So how do you tell a story to investors that let them both understand the gravity of the challenge that you're taking on, but at the same time be able to show them that there's a very market-driven, profitable solution? And the two are not necessarily always compatible. And so how do you tell that story? So we want to be emphasizing that. The other thing that we bring up in 1 to 2 of our sessions is this issue of impact measurement. And this is where I think the field of climate tech investment can kind of take a page out of the book of impact investment writ large, where you are going to be tasked with assessing what is the actual impact or footprint or I am having on either GHG avoidance and reductions or some climate adaptation goal. And investors want to know that, your team wants to know that, your partners want to know that, but humanity also needs it. right? It's something that is critical. And if entrepreneurs aren't ready to do that measurement process and put that framework in place, we can help them with that. And a lot of that entails just getting people familiar with what questions they need to be asking when determining impact. The last thing that I'll say is that I think we're going to start focusing more on teams as well. A lot of the entrepreneurs that come to us are still in their idea stage, so they haven't even begun to start building out a team yet. Climate is a very, very technical field, right? I think everybody's waking up to that if they didn't know already. And I still am learning what that even looks like. What are the skill sets that are most needed right now? A lot of people are trying to work on climate, and a lot of us are struggling to figure out where do we really fit in, what's in most demand. So when you're building a team, knowing exactly not just when to hire and the roles you're trying to fill out, but how do you assess candidates to understand if they're really experts in a field that is evolving rapidly? It can be quite challenging. So I think team building is another area we'll focus on. In parallel to the sessions, we're assigning exercises, so getting them to work on positioning statements, research on their problems, identifying the impact domain they want to focus on. So there's exercises and homework that we ask them to do. I think the other thing that I'm most excited about that we do is introduce them to mentors. So there's many limitations of what I as just one individual can do, of course. We have amazing instructors that work with me, but there's also limitations of what we can do in an hour and a half. Even if you attend all 8 sessions, there's so many questions that you're going to walk away with regardless. So if we can bring in mentors, and we try to average like 2 to 3 mentors per entrepreneur. We don't set expectations on what they have to achieve. We want them to get to know each other and enjoy knowing each other, and then explore ways they can work. But the mentorship is something that we put a really, really high premium on, and something that I hope will distinguish us over time, and something that we always want to keep building out. So if people are listening that are interested in being mentors, we always love to talk to them.
Sure. I mean, that sounds like that's a ton of value for anyone launching a startup, helping with storytelling, impact measurement specifically related to climate, team building, mentor intros. I think that's basically all you need for a startup, and that's all the most important value adds there could be. My next question would be, you yourself have invested in several climate startups. What's your criteria when evaluating an investment in a climate startup?
Sure. So I feel like I've got a kind of a common answer across all the questions, and it's evolving over time. So I still am trying to figure out what's the best way to vet a company at the early stages that you're not going to have a lot of data available on it. You're probably not going to get a lot of face time with the founder. You're not going to be able to talk to many customers, if any, right? So there's not a lot of data points you can look at. And so I'm always having to figure out what my approach is. And I hope by being really honest about it, it could also help others be honest about their own questions and challenges in this. I get really excited when I meet somebody that I'm learning from and I'm enjoying talking to them. If I can see that they're really good communicators, that they've got energy, but they're also good listeners, that they're not afraid to ask questions when they don't know the answer, or admit that they don't know something, comfortable with confusion. Like, these are things that I think all demonstrate a certain level of vulnerability, but also maturity in a founder. And so that's something that I look when I trying to figure out if I want to work with somebody on something in general. So I would still apply that to thinking about an early stage company. At that point too, I realized that assessing product market fit and trying to, run the numbers on market size, it's already a difficult exercise when you have data to work with. At that stage, I admire the investors that are able to do that with confidence. I'm not yet. It's hard to tell how quickly and large can something grow, especially when there's a good chance that entrepreneur in a year is going to pivot away from it. So I always feel like the diligence you're doing at that stage is going to be almost rendered obsolete kind of quickly. So I don't want to get too drawn into that process, because it may lead me making a wrong decision. It might make me want to not invest when, in fact, if I just kind of listened to my gut and got to know the person, I would. The other thing, which is really common in VC, I don't think we say it enough, I have no reservations if somebody a lot smarter than me comes and says, this is a really good opportunity, you should look at it. That happens all the time in VC. People are always sharing deals. I know funds like to say that they have their own unique diligence processes and formulas for picking winners. I don't. And so I am very open and welcome to people coming with an awesome entrepreneur that they think I should get to know and support in some way. I very rarely say no to that. I would rather do that probably more often than not than have to go source the companies on my own and have to use a process that I developed because I'm still figuring a lot of this out.
Sure, totally. That makes sense. I think evaluating the person or getting advice from others that you trust, I think, are definitely always good ways to go about it. I guess switching gears a little bit, there's another INSEAD alum that I met when I was joining the MBA, actually, who introduced me to the concept of the portfolio career where you're working on several different things at once. And that seems like that's kind of what you're doing. So I was wondering how you balance all the different projects you're working on. How do you choose what to focus on most? And how do you balance your day when you have so many responsibilities?
So it's something that I've gotten better at doing over the past year, though I guess part of my New Year's resolution, I've made a point of getting better at it. Despite the fact that I feel like I'm improving, I still I guess what I'm saying is I still have a ways to go before I can really be confident in it. But on one hand, this year, and I think this started when I launched the Bootcamp, I had to start putting on a bit of a builder's mindset, right? Where I wasn't just, yes, I had a portfolio approach to my career, but I had to be thinking a lot more long-term than I was before, right? Like the bootcamp, yes, it generates revenue, but it's not my full-time focus yet. And it could be at some point. And to get it to that point, I would have to go through a lot of piloting and testing and making mistakes before I even knew if there was something really there that I could institutionalize and work on for the long run. So point being in that, you're not going to get short-term gratification out of it. It's going to be something that pays off in the long run. Of course, I love doing it. So you could say that that is a form of short-term gratification. But in terms of getting compensated for it, I mean, it's something that plays out over years, I think. So part of the balancing is not just balancing tasks, but it's balancing long and short-term priorities, where I've had to say, this is something that I think is going to be really important for future Jamil, right? Over the next 10 years, I want this to be something that I fill gradually with intentionality, but also just happen slowly. So that's been one thing that's been really helpful, is just putting on that long-term mindset. The short-term mindset has obviously, it's around direct advising that I do as a consultant for different groups, right? And what's nice about that is that there is lots of forcing functions in that field, right? People coming to you, setting deadlines and saying that you need to deliver on a certain time. So the more forcing functions, the better. My colleague and business partner, Suma Reddy, often talks to me about forcing functions. And I think one of the tricks is, if you're doing a portfolio career, be really vigilant about what those forcing functions are. And if they're not there, try to build them in as much as you can. The last thing that I think is important to balancing is being very comfortable with the ambiguity that comes along with it. Because I think if you start to get too anxious about the ambiguity, it pulls away or detracts from your ability to just manage your time, because you're worrying about uncertainty. And it's taken a while for me to become more comfortable with uncertainty. I've had to stop thinking about it as a negative and see it as something that is actually an opportunity to open doors that I just don't know where they're leading. And so if you take the uncertainty and combine it with that long-term mindset I mentioned, you put on the hat, I think, of somebody who is planting seeds all the time, right? Where you're saying, I don't know where these things are going to go. I'm not sure what's going to grow big, what's going to grow small, what's going to not grow at all. And so once you realize that there is always going to be some type of long-term game or long-term games you have to play, and at the same time, you don't know what those things are going to look like, it forces you to be much more of a seed planter than anything. And so as I've quote unquote matured a little bit over this past year, I've had to become a lot more comfortable with playing that role, which means that I don't see them bear fruit right away, right? It's a waiting game, but it's one that I've become much more amenable to over the past 10, 12 months, and really happy where things are right now.
Makes a lot of sense. Focusing on the long term and then having the short term forcing functions to pay the bills and
yeah, exactly. Short term forcing functions. Yep. Yeah. And the seeds. Can't forget the seeds.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Very good. One last question. What advice do you have for young people who are hoping to tackle climate change as part of their careers, whether as an entrepreneur or more traditional career?
Sure. So there's a lot there, I think. And I think we're still trying to think through, how do you move talent into climate, right? Like there's a lot of commendable efforts are happening across the board with guiding people to climate careers, in no particular order, My Climate Journey, Work on Climate, Climate Draft. three of a growing pool of different platforms that people are starting. And I think that when people talk to me one-on-one, of course, sometimes I just direct them towards one of those platforms because they're mandated to help kind of answer that question that I'm usually getting asked. But I was talking to somebody yesterday about it, and a couple of pieces of advice that were exchanged during that call, and it could be useful for others. So I think on one hand, the field is moving so rapidly that I think it's kind of incumbent on us to build as many relationships as possible and keep growing those relationships as possible with other people working on climate, right? Because that's where I think the bulk of the learnings are going to come. Reading articles, reports, et cetera, can be helpful, but they're only going to show you a snapshot of where the world is at a previous time. And if the field is evolving so rapidly, then it's need to be keeping pace. And you do that by speaking with people, I think, as opposed to going back to the literature. So that's something that I feel like everybody's got to do. Build a community, be part of community or communities. Otherwise, I think you're going to find yourself falling behind. And we all fall behind, and it's a struggle to keep up to speed, but you will find yourself in a much more difficult position if you don't. The other thing that I recommend is be really rigorous with trying to understand the type of impact that you want to contribute to. When we talk about climate, oftentimes we default to thinking purely about energy and decarbonization. Those are mission critical for the survival of humankind. At the same time, there's a growing number of parallel concerns that aren't directly linked to GHG, but they're going to get exacerbated by the prevalence of carbon and GHGs and climate change. And what I mean here is just the field of climate adaptation, where there is a growing concern about unpredictability of weather patterns, about stress and what we call like threat multiplier effects that are going to be placed upon society and economy. Right? The solutions for those won't show up in the form of solar and EVs and direct air capture and fusion, et cetera. They're going to show up in the form of us just being smarter with how we collect and use data around weather, right? Helping farmers in anywhere in the world, but specifically in agrarian societies that rely heavily on the agriculture sector to have drought-resistant seeds, right? Or better technologies to predict when a flood is coming, right? So those are not necessarily your go-to examples of climate impact when you're trying to enter this field and also when you're working in it, but we're realizing that they are also mission critical, because if we don't have food, if we're not protecting our water systems, if we're not protecting our healthcare systems, we will and have been seeing a large uptick in food and waterborne diseases as a result of climate. So health is obviously critical here. So if we're not thinking about those issues and purely trying to decarbonize, which again, I don't want to detract from that, we need more people working on that. But if we're not also getting people to work on these other important domains, then we're going to realize that even if we get to the point where we're decarbonized or making a meaningful dent in that effort, it'll have been several decades and countries will have disappeared by then, right? And people have had to migrate from their homes permanently. And there's going to be a whole slew of other issues that we're not even probably aware of yet that are going to be on our front doors or in our living rooms at that point. And so people that are trying to enter this space, I'd encourage them to be really, really rigorous and think critically about the type of impact that they're trying to achieve. And last thing I'd say is that it's really important to keep this seed planter mentality, right? Because there's still a lot of question marks around which technology is really going to be scaling and what's going to have the biggest impact. Like, I think we're already sure that there's a very bright and exciting future around the renewable energy space, but there's a slew of other technologies that people are trying to get into the market that we're still trying to figure out, like, what is the longevity here? So if you're going to be working on those, you're going to have to embrace the uncertainty and also be comfortable with the fact that you're kind of a drop in the ocean or a grain of sand in a larger pile of sand that's just contributing. So the more you can be an enabler and planting of these seeds, helping others as much as possible, I think you maximize your chances of not just making a move into climate, but doing something meaningful within it.
Sure. Yeah, I think those are all really great points. Climate impacts everything, or I guess climate is everything really. So that there's talent needed across the board, and it's something that's going to need a lot of long-term thinking as well. So anyway, really appreciate you joining, Jamil. It was super valuable information and really interesting to hear more about your journey and the impact you're having. Where can people find Climate Bootcamp if they're interested in joining or becoming a mentor?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can always email me. So it's Jamil at climatebootcamp.tech. And then if they want to just visit the site for the bootcamp, it's just climatebootcamp.tech as well. So we actually just launched our new site. I'm excited to show it off to people, and hopefully we haven't made any errors on the back end and everything's working properly. So if people go, we'll find out soon enough if the website's working or not, I guess.
Sure. Amazing. Thanks so much. Really appreciate you joining.
Thanks a lot, Nick, and all the best in the podcast. Again, really glad you're doing this and really important.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. To stay up to date on events we may be hosting, emerging market news, and to build your personal network, please feel free to join the INSEAD Alumni Emerging Markets Interest Group on LinkedIn.